welcome to this webinar, which is about balancing act, a life that changed the way we work. And it is part of the Social Sciences Festival, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with Joanna Foster, CBE. I am Simonetta Manfredi. I'm a professor of equality and diversity management at Oxford Brookes University. And we are here to discuss Joanna's work, Joanna's career, which has been absolutely amazing. I won't be able to go through all the things that she has done, because otherwise it would take the entire hour. But I will only say some of the highlights, mention some of the very, well, there are many highlights. Let's say the one that I picked up. I mean, one thing, first of all, Joanna is one of those people who have really worked throughout her life to achieve positive change. And the positive change that she has achieved, and I think we all owe to her, is about developing work-life balance, not just as a concept, but also as a practice, which now is widely adopted in the workplace. And it's so important. So many of us to combine our work with also our private life, caring responsibility, but what else is going on in our private life as well as paid work. In 1987, she was appointed chair of the Equal Opportunity Commission. And in that role, she really championed family-friendly policies and drove that agenda to achieve greater equality and greater opportunities for women. And I'm sure she will tell us more about that work. Then in 2002, she left the Equal Opportunity Commission. She spent a year chairing the International Year of the Family for the United Nations, which again underline all the great need that there is across the world to enable men and women to better balance their responsibility with their paid work. She also took part in some projects like the BT Communication Forum, which then evolved into the National Work Life Forum, which influenced greatly the Blair government. More recently, she has also been on various boards like the Eloise TBS Foundation, the Kraft Council, Nuffield Orthopedics. But I also like to say that we are very, very privileged at Oxford Brookes. We had a connection with Joanna Foster that we really value, because she was one of our board of governors shortly after Oxford Brookes became a university. And we also she has been incredibly championing equalities in that role and supporting many of us here at Oxford Brookes doing research on gender equality, work-life balance. But we're also very lucky that we host her collection. So in our library, we have the collection of documents, writings, collected throughout her life, which are testimony of the work that she has done in this area, and which is there now available to researchers and whoever is interested. What we are doing this evening as part of the Social Sciences Festivals, not only to celebrate really Joanna's work and her life, and what she has achieved and what she has given us, but also to launch what we decided to do in order to make her work even more accessible, in addition to what is already stored in our library, to do a series of podcasts. We've done 3 podcasts, which cover, the first one covers the early years of Joanna's work in this area, and then there is a second podcast and the third. Now, the podcasts again are widely available. What we like to do this evening is to talk a little bit about some of the highlights in each of the podcasts. Each podcast lasts 20 minutes, so they're very easy and accessible to listen. They don't put too much demand on people's time. And but then what we are also particularly interested, and Joanna is particularly interested, is really to open up a bit of a conversation with you to find out what are your thoughts about this. I think we need to be careful not to give work-life balance for granted. It's something which is very important, has taken decades of work, as we will hear in a moment. To reach this stage, we need to be careful that we maintain this. So we really want to hear your views, and you can do that in several times. You can either use a question and answer, or you can use a chat. But our preferred way would be, if you're happy to speak, we can unmute you, and you can actually put your points or questions directly to Joanna. So enough about me speaking. So I think, Joanna, if we go over to you, and thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Is there anything in your career that I missed that perhaps you would like to mention, which was particularly of particular importance in terms of you starting to work in this area?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm delighted to be here. It's very good to be back at Oxford Brookes. So thank you for your introduction. I'm rather tired at the thought of all the things you've said about me, but they've been very exciting. But thinking about the beginning, I always in my work life have gone from where I am in my life. And the early days that really got me going on the work-life balance, equal opportunities side was being a trailing spouse to my husband, who was recruited to the INSEAD Business School. And I wondered, I was doing some research there, but there were a lot of young women who were wives, partners then, and they were wondering with their partners who, their husbands who were doing the MBAs and later on the executive programs and then the senior programs, what's their life going to be when they're having to trail around after their husband, if that was going to be the case. And there was a very influential book that came out with one of my colleague professors, Fernando Bartolome, called Must Success Cost So Much? Very important question, because it was quite clear, particularly as you got up the business ladder, that particularly if you're international, that you're not seeing a lot of your family. You often didn't see your children as they were growing up and at key points. And increasingly, as people went up the ladder, there was the issue about caring for elderly parents. So in a way, that got me going. Then moved from Paris to Pittsburgh, big cultural move that. And I became involved in some of the work that was going on with the big Western Psychiatric Institute, then part of the University of Pittsburgh, in helping the teams and the senior managers in the steel mills, which were beginning to be run down. And they were beginning to feel the stress, their own stress, their wives' stress, their children's stress, as well as all the employees. So we started doing stress management programs, and it became quite clear that they had very little balance in their life. So we evolved our stress management programs, went on doing that, but started developing work-life balance programs. And lo and behold, back from Pittsburgh to Oxford, where I had to decide what was I going to do next in my life. And I went back to where I'd originally worked, the Industrial Society, which is all about developing people. And I went to lead the Pepperell Unit's work, which is about developing women and helping employers who are already beginning to pronounce themselves as equal opportunity employers, but really didn't have much idea about how to make rhetoric into reality. So those were the early stages, the seeds.
Yes, the early stages, the seeds of your work, which we cover in the first podcast broadly. And you've done so much traveling also in those early stages as well. Did you see any major cultural differences major cultural differences in the gender relationship, in the way people also approach this issue of work-life balance? Was it in some cases something that you don't talk about, or you keep it, you keep your family out of the workplace, or was there more of a acknowledgement that could be an issue?
Well, in France, it was, and I don't know if it's still going on, a very nice habit that on Wednesdays, there was no school in the afternoon in particular. And so that was a wonderful way of spending time with one's family. And in France, they have been very family-minded. Now, America was different. They'd begun to get a grip on equality and equal opportunities, coming out of course, all the race relations work. And they were just beginning to think about how can we be much more profitable as organizations. And surprise, surprise, and this is exactly the same, came back to England, there was realization that actually this was a business issue and not just a community or gender or family issue, that if companies or organizations started employing women who were doing very well coming out of organizations and out of universities, then that was going to be good for their business. So that was an audience that was very important to listen to. And women were busy saying, I want to have more to my life than my mother's had, for instance. So there was quite a stir, and there was already some good equal opportunities legislation. There was Equal Opportunities Commission, and just the beginnings of what the European Union were doing with their directives and their legislation. So there was a lot around which was encouraging people, but they needed a lot of practical advice as well.
Yeah, there was quite a lot going on as from what you're saying, and yes, we cover also a lot of this in the podcast. So, in terms of what lesson do you think employers of today from those early development and also the policymakers could learn from those early developments?
Well, I suppose what struck me so strongly is that there was quite a steady realization that
Mm,
women do contribute rather brilliantly to any organization they go into, and that diversity equals creativity. But this took a little bit of working at, because if you're going to employ and recruit clever women, then you don't want to lose them, because that's not a very good investment. So you have to begin to think, what does family-friendly employment look like, and what are the issues that women mind about, and how do we stop them burning out? How do we stop women leaving the workforce and not being able to get back into the workforce at a good level again? Because often women went back, but not at a good level, and the
yeah.
pay reflected that as well.
Yes, that is open. I mean, I've seen that also happening throughout my career. Colleagues and coming up, maybe taking a step down their career, and in order to come back to work, and then gradually finding the way of going back. But they lost years that instead they could have used much more productively.
And the sheer numbers, very few women in politics, very few
Yeah,
women high up in the organization, and part-time women and women who are not in uh, good enough jobs were earning so little as well. So there was very
yeah.
multifaceted as what was going on.
Issue, yeah. So if we go into trying to go into some of the highlights of podcast two. Now, in podcast two, you talk about your work when you have been appointed as chair of the Equal Opportunity Commission, and so that is 1987. You also had to overcome some of the political resistance at the time. Margaret, although we had a woman prime minister, Margaret Thatcher, but we all know that she wasn't particularly supportive of these ideas, and also all the work at the European Union that was going on at the time, and how that influenced the UK. And so tell us a little bit more about that. And I think it's also very important, because maybe it's important for people to understand how much was UK driven and how much perhaps was the influence of the EU. The UK had to respond to the EU, and that had a positive influence on some of the things that we can enjoy now.
Okay, well, let me start with the Equal Opportunities Commission. I, of course, was excited and rather amazed to be asked to do it. And it came on the back of the work that we've been doing at the Industrial Society with the PEPL unit, which
Mhm.
had a very, very high profile in the media, not least because so many of the women journalists were struggling, like we all were, with balancing their career with trying to be good parents and carers. And so every case that was won, every discrimination case that was won, it had very good media. And I have to say that it was very important. And I think that added enormously to me being appointed to the EOCs, that I was a slightly different way of looking at it from my predecessor, the wonderful Beryl Platt, who really championed women into engineering, which has been very successful. But we wanted to champion, in particular, family-friendly employment and part-time and equal pay. And we had two major ways of doing that. One was the legislation, taking cases, doing formal investigations. The other was to do the promotion. And the promotion was very important. We had an employers forum, which was based on good practice. How do we do it? What do we have to do if we're going to get women to come back? What about the men? What are they going to think? And then the cases. And there were some key cases, for instance, in the National Health Service. There was a young woman who wanted to become a midwife, and at the interview, somebody had the stupidity really to say, well, we think you should probably stay at home and not get more training to become a midwife. So that, needless to say, got us going at the Equal Opportunities Commission. We said, would you like us to look at you very carefully, or would you like to go to court? And now when I look at the flexibility there is within the NHS, I'm glad we took a lot of attention to the NHS case.
Yes, yes, and how important it is.
Yes.
That,
Now,
that
the political climate was quite challenging because my commission, I had a wonderful commission, very diverse, came from private sector, the public sector, trade unions, and everybody had their own part of their world in which we were going to convey the message and encourage people to take on equal opportunities and to look at flexible working and to look at, well, actually, well-being hadn't been invented as a term then. But it's true that our then Prime Minister, Maggie Thatcher, clearly didn't think that family-friendly employment was brilliant. After all, she managed to have twins in 9 months. I always reckon she economised on
yes,
maternity leave. And she wasn't at all keen on the fact that the European Union had a very strong equality department, and I had a fun year chairing that at one point. We did it circularly different countries, and we all learnt from each other as to where the good practice was, from the research, from the actual policy turning into practice. And of course, our then Prime Minister was not at all keen on me talking about the fact that families were more than just 2+2 and came in all sizes and all shapes, and wasn't at all keen on us being able to take on board the directives from Brussels, which turned out to be really important, whether it was flexible working and all the things that we thought were important to us.
and how did you navigate that not easy political, because you were trying to push for reforms, for best practice, but you didn't have necessarily full political support. How did you navigate that pushback on?
Well, I mentioned a little while ago that one of the arguments is clearly it being good for business. And actually, the government was pretty keen on business, as all governments are. And it was quite clear that as the senior members of companies, private companies, as well as in the public sector, were realizing this, then that was quite a message to government as well, as that if there was going to be any growth and there was going to be some profitability, then actually using women's brains and helping them up the organization was important. And also looking at the bottom of organizations, getting some training and education and getting the pay very, very much better. And it has gradually got better. It's not good enough yet, but our legislation, it took 10 years to get the first successful equal pay case through.
And so the business case was quite, from what you say, the business case was really important in terms of engaging with employers.
It was key, and with the trade unions as well, who were
As well,
very, very keen on that.
Yeah, to win them over. And you mentioned before one of the cases that you had. Well, I don't think perhaps it went to court. You mentioned before with the NHS. Is there any other discrimination cases or other campaigns that you oversaw at the time that you think they were absolutely crucial turning points?
Well, I think the message about listening to people was as important as some of the legislation. And coming back to our audiences, we had to get the politician thinking this was a good idea and good for the country. But there was one particular day which illustrates this, of listening carefully to one's audiences, which of course politicians need to do more and more and better. It started with my mother meeting me at Paddington Station and saying, "Where's your hat and where are your gloves and why is your skirt so short?" And that was because I was talking to her club, and her club was the Women's Institute, and it was an annual general meeting at the Royal Albert Hall. And she was completely terrified that I was going to say something wildly feminist and she was going to be shout out feminist rubbish. Anyway, she did manage to keep quiet. And I had understood the audience. It was a very big audience, quite a frightening audience, because 6,000 people is quite a big audience. So understanding what was going on in families with grandmothers and mothers and their daughters. The next appointment I had that day was at the CBI, the Confederation British Industry. And I remember being a little daunted by the chairman saying, and Mrs. Foster, can you just remember we employ between two-thirds of the British industrial employment. And I was worried about the Q&A because the CBI had opposed us every time we won a good case. They said, this is shocking, it's going to ruin the British economy.
Yeah.
But at the end of the Q&A, one of the men down there were just 12 of them around this great mahogany table, and one of them said, my daughter's having an awful difficulty getting up in the legal world, absolutely cement ceilings. And this emboldened the man opposite, who said, my daughter is in the NHS and she wants to become a consultant, and it's very difficult. There's a lot of bias and discrimination. So they got the message about it being good for business. And actually, it was a very useful strategy that about getting men to talk about the pride of their daughters and their skill, their brainy daughters. So I've used that a lot in talking to men about their wonderful daughters, as well as what they're contributing to the workplace. And the third occasion that day was to come back to Oxford and to in a debate in the Oxford Union here, and that was full of young people. And I was opposing the motion that feminism was irrelevant. And I have to say that my main opposition, she had 11 children, so I'm not quite sure where her work-life balance came in, but maybe she had lots of help. But that got over to me very early stages. We have very different audiences, but completely key and fundamental to all of this was what we were doing ourselves, where our networks were, what our aspirations were we learning to be a little more assertive, and how were we surviving, trying to work, to commute, to be good parents, begin to look after our aging parents. So the audiences, and I would say this is a message for the future, continue to be really important. Slightly different messages for different audiences and a lot of listening.
So yes, you told us something which is really important, as you say, the different messages. So adapting the message. It's not different messages. The message is same, but it's about adapting the message to a particular or to the different audiences.
And
So
it's about opportunities, not just equity. It's about equal opportunities.
opportunities, yeah.
And that's why the work-life balance is as relevant to men, actually, I think, as it is to women these days. There was one occasion when there were a lot of networks, women were starting networks in their organizations, and Reuters said, we want a women's network. And their male colleagues said, oh no, we want to have a network for us as well. We travel around the world. We've got young families. We've got elderly parents. So they started a network to look at how they could get more flexibility and work-life balance for them. And I think, what is good for women in the workplace is usually very good for men as well.
No, absolutely, because finally it's about improving life for everybody, not
Yes.
just the women. And I think there is much more, and we discussed this also in the podcast, there is much more attention, the younger generations and the men as well, they really want to spend time with their families. They don't want to miss out. I mean, I remember in the past reading some research how men felt that they couldn't even speak about families in the workplace. That was something.
No, yes.
Yeah, no, and that the family have to be almost kept as something that you don't talk about it. Otherwise, it would have been interpreted as a lack of commitments to your career, etc. So it's really, I think, what has happened probably with the work that you've done has been almost liberating for the men, so they can also say, well, we also have care responsibilities. Not just the women, and they can have a different relationship with their families, and that can be discussed in the workplace. It's accepted when it wasn't acceptable in the past.
There is one issue, though, about men taking, for instance, leave themselves. They feel that their career will be tainted if they take parental or paternity leave, that kind of leave.
Yes.
And I think that needs, like in Scandinavia, to be overcome. It needs to be absolutely normal.
Yes, and I suppose some of the things that I saw, that some of the leave arrangements seems to be work best, some of the Scandinavian leave arrangements, when the leave, there is a dedicated leave for each parent, and if the parent doesn't take it, it's lost. While here, now that we have opportunity to share it, so the woman can all still take the whole parental leave, um, and that wouldn't be lost. But having a parental leave legislation which has an entitlement for each parent, and if each parent doesn't take it, that entitlement is lost. It seems that that is probably a best arrangement in terms of ensuring the men take also their parental leave as well.
And the issue about our elderly population, our aging population, is incredibly important for the future as well, for men and women.
And women, absolutely, which is moving us towards the third podcast, where we also started to discuss a little bit more about the future. I mean, in the third podcast, of course, we have reached the milestone of the Equality Act. You expressed your thoughts about the Equality Act of 2010, how important it was, the rise of flexible working. We now have even legislation which requires employers to consider request for flexible working, which is very, very, very useful indeed. And I'm proud to say that at Oxford Brookes, we actually, I remember that the initial legislation was about flexible working, but for parents with very young children. And Oxford Brookes, we made the decision to extend that to everybody who ever wanted to ask for it. And then eventually the legislation was extended to everybody. So we anticipated some of the legislative's trend. But look, in the third podcast, we talk a little bit about the most recent events and how these have impacted on flexible working, work-life balance, things like the financial crisis, the austerity, but also the pandemic. And the pandemic, we talked about a possible silver lining from the pandemic that actually accelerated the hybrid working. There was so much, I remember, conversation about whether people working from home was a good idea, a bad idea. Would people work? Would people do the work they're supposed to do? Well, all of a sudden, we all had to work from home, and we realized that you can't do that. But thinking a little bit about the future and or the time when we're going through, what are your thoughts around that, Joanna? And then it would be interesting also to hear from our audience.
Well, I think a key moment was the financial crisis,
Yeah.
which had a bad effect on families, on households. Obviously, the construction areas and lots of major areas had a big effect, but that affected women and families a lot. And then, of course, COVID. And in some ways, I think people rejoiced how nice to be at home, to be able, particularly if you had a garden and you had a dog and you could do all that. But actually, for women, it was tough. A third shift, as the Boston work-life group have described it as. So as well as schooling, homeschooling, as well as running the domestic house, as well as looking after the children, as well as trying to keep the quality of one's own work up if one still had a job. That all was very pressurized. And interestingly, there's been some research about how men, when working at home, a lot of them got promotion, even during COVID time. You're absolutely right. We learned about hybrid working. We learned that we could be as productive living at home and working at home. Of course, now that's all begun to change a lot. And I'd be very interested in having people's views about how well is it working? What are some of the challenges in the future? I feel that AI is a big challenge, and I feel for women, we need to look at our skills. What skills and qualifications are we coming out with? Looking at some of the AI organizations and where it's all been set up, that has mostly been men coming up with systems, whether it's about medical systems or other. We need to get in there and really make sure that we're going to be part of this whole exciting, scientific and challenging future. But also trying to work out the flexible working. I know employers want to fill their empty buildings again, and I know that for me, working with colleagues is very stimulating, but very nice not to have to go into work every day. So there are a lot of issues around the future, and I think it would be great to have some questions.
Yes, and you mentioned the AI and the tech brothers, but where I just made, before joining this conversation, I thought to myself, where are the tech sisters? We
You're
need more
right.
of them.
Yes.
So can we open it up to the audience now? You can either tell us whether you wish to be unmuted and make a contribution or ask questions or just share your experience. But equally, you can use a chat function or the questions function as you prefer.
And what are your hopes for how we don't let what we've achieved to this point slip? It seems to me that the future has got a big shadow from across the Atlantic when all the, as we know, the really good workers, a lot of it's just had its head chopped off at the moment. And so I don't want that to be spreading here with American-based companies. It's incredibly important we keep up our standards and our hopes and women's hopes and men's hopes.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And I'm afraid a little bit are starting to spread over some of the American-based companies here in this country. So please, just please join us in the conversation. If you want to be unmuted, just send us put a question in the chat or a message. Okay. So Larissa, do you want to be unmuted or shall I read out your question? I'll just read out her question first. If enabling women to thrive not only boosts well-being and productivity for men, but also makes clear business sense, why are so many leaders still hesitant to drive systematic change?
Oh, I think there's a lot of tradition and there's a lot of feeling about power, and I think tradition and the way it's been plays a much stronger role. And I think, you know, who is controlling what is still very much there. I don't know what you all think.
Mm. Is there anyone who has got any views about how we have? Oh, we got Sarah. Oh, hi, Sarah. I have a question and I'm happy to be unmuted. Can we unmute Sarah? I know we got our yeah, I can see Sarah.
Hi, Simonetta. Hi, Joanna.
Hi.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. I completely agree that one of the ways we can best support women in the workplace and their work-life balance is to support and encourage men to take a full part in childcare, including taking parental leave of under whatever title it has. And so I was interested in the example you gave from Scandinavia of where it's not positioned as being parental leave that either can take, it's separated out for the two different parents. I think I'm right in saying that as an institution, we don't have the option to do that under our current legislation. And so I just wondered whether you had any reflections on what best practice is for an institution in this country, and whether there are any other ways that you've seen to address that particular issue about encouraging and enabling men to play their part in order to support careers and work-life balance for women.
One of the major tools we used in the beginning of the 90s was an organization set up called Opportunity Now, which was actually chaired by Elspeth Howe, who was deputy chair when the EOC was first set up. And this was entirely made up of people who were right at the top. It was the private companies. And I believe that the leadership in recognizing that it's very good for business and organization as well as for families remains hugely important. So getting the issue back into the discussion in organizations and in leadership training and helping, well, the training is tremendously key for men and for women. I think that's a key issue at the moment.
We also have a question, which I suppose to a certain extent follows on from what Sarah said, which is about how do we ensure that women grow and get into more leadership role?
Well, we come straight back to training. Certainly in the years gone by, there was so much training on offer, whether it was assertiveness training, was it stress management training, was it well-being? And I think there's a lot of emphasis on well-being. But certainly thinking of my granddaughters, I'm hoping that in education and in university life and in training, the young women are understanding that actually they can do all sorts of things they want to do, but they're going to have to be skilled to do it. And they're going to have to be, think about the balance themselves if they want to be parents and if they've got elderly parents to look after as well. So we've got to encourage the young women and the young men, as well as their bosses and the managers and the leaders and the politicians.
There is another question here, Joanna, that I'm reading out to you, which is from Jennifer. Can you please speak on plausible future considerations with an aging workforce in regards to people transitioning to needing more modifications in their own work and the occurrence of mild cognitive impairments within the workplace? Of course, more time is needed to shift work duties, and flexibility for medical appointments will make a difference in genders.
Well, of course, flexible working is completely key, and employers and one's manager understanding that it's important that we can have medical appointments and take time out, and that this is not showing being a bad worker. So I do think that the legislation and the rights that individuals have are important, but it's got to be balanced again with back to what can we all give if we're working flexibly? How is our work going to be productive and going to show that it's productive? So I think there's a balance each side. So there's give, and there needs to be trust that if we're working flexibly or working from home, that we're keeping up the standards and that the employers need to trust that that's happening.
Yes, I remember several years ago, maybe even more than a decade before we all had to learn how to work from home, that there was this concern. There was a lot of discussion about working remotely, but this was a main concern and what you just said, trust. Can people be trusted to do the work? How is it was all down to trust, and nobody knew how that would work. And then the pandemic came and we had a taste of that. I've got a couple of colleagues who are happy to be unmuted. One is Lucy and one is Tina, Lucy Vickers and Tina Miller. So if we start with you, Lucy.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, it's just a wonder whether you have any comments on this. And one of the things that I find very depressing about the advance in equality over the last decades is that as women do better in particular sectors, those sectors become devalued, and potentially that impacts on things like equal pay and so on from it. So I'm thinking about education, teaching, starting to be law. I'm a lawyer. Starting to be medicine, vet medicine, these jobs that were seen as the sort of pinnacle for women to achieve, and women have achieved. And it feels as though in some senses the achievements there are then being devalued. People go, oh, well, it's not that hard to be a doctor, not that hard to be a vet, not that hard to be an MP or whatever these different roles are. And I just wondered if you'd observed that. It's something I've read about as an issue, and I wondered if you'd observed it and whether you had any comments about it.
Certainly, I think it's extremely hard to be a woman MP, given all the horrible social media stuff they get. I just think that we want to encourage the good stories and the examples about how exciting as well as how challenging it is. And that's why work-life balance is so important, because when we have all these huge pressures, and we've got to be able to recover and give ourselves some time to not to be exhausted and to be able to do the caring we want to do. But I'm interested in your view about how one can stop, in quotes, women's jobs not being depressed.
I mean, I guess one thing is that we have to look at balance for both. So one thing you can do And one of the things I've tried to do in an organisation I'm involved in, where we had a title that was secretary, so you were sort of the subjects, the honorary secretary to the organisation, which was always men. And then now it's been women. It's now had 2 or 3 rounds of it being women, and we're really worried that it's going to start to be seen as a woman's job, and also that it's not, doesn't have the status that it did. So I think one thing is that we should be watching to ensure that we get balance back, so we make sure that some men do the job that's called secretary, as well as obviously working to make sure there's nothing wrong with being the secretary anyway, but just
I wonder whether
trying to get...
AI is going to take on that role anyway.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of the more the lower jobs will go, and that's why upskilling women
Yes.
and men is going to be so important, because otherwise the robots are going to be doing it all.
Yeah, and there's a real problem, isn't there, of, well, our AI and the algorithms and the discriminatory algorithms that they work by, and also a stereotype around women in science. So I totally agreed with what you were saying about those early days when a lot of this equal opportunities was about women in science, but it's also a really important thing that we make sure there are women working in tech, because there's no reason why women can't.
And I'm very impressed these days with so many, I suppose because there's so much war and conflict around the world, absolutely brilliant women there are reporting from difficult places. But there are women doing all sorts of interesting roles on the media. And I just think the more visibility we have of women doing very interesting and high-level roles is terribly important for the young. I remember when we did a series, this is before I went to the EOC, we wanted to have some public work done for women, and we went in with Cosmopolitan magazine. My mother was horrified, thought it was going to be a day about sex. But in fact, it was a day about women's aspirations, about where they want to go and how they're going to get there. And I needed 2 role models. And I got Anita, who has started the Body Shop, and Prue Leith. And as role models, they were incredibly important because they both started their businesses and they both had young children. And the more we can show, both men and women, in showing that they're balancing, that they're skillful, they've got to where they want to get, and they're managing to keep their sanity with pressure at work, as well as trying to do all the things in one's personal life. So I'm absolutely back to, where are the role models? Where are the women supporting women? Where are the men supporting women, and vice versa? So the storytelling remains important.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have Tina, who asked to be unmuted, and then I think we have another 3-4 questions are coming through. So thank you very much. It's really good to see your comments, and we'll read them out, all of them. So Tina.
Thank you, Simonetta, and hello, Joanna. And
Hi, Tina.
We've met before, and thank you very much for all the work you've done, because it really has been groundbreaking. So it's fantastic to hear you speaking about it this evening. Yes, several things I really want to say. This overlaps with some of my own research about looking where I follow mothers and fathers in transition into first-time parenthood. And in my most recent study, which was published in 2023, I was completely dismayed to find that although the discourse of work-family balance was very well embedded and understood and taken on and used in the early interviews, once they became a parent and that first year unfolded, the practice of being able to balance was really difficult to achieve, despite the sort of best of intentions. And that really hinges on a lot of what you've been talking about. We understand productivity in a very narrow way that too often is about being present at work. We value productivity in the workplace rather than caring, whether that's for babies, children, or elderly relatives, or older dependent adults. So we really have sort of confused. I think society has a problem with how we think about productivity and work, and what constitutes work, and caring. So I think that's part of some of the issues. But I think that we also know what does work. And you were talking about Scandinavia. And there's some great research that shows that if fathers have their own entitlement to paternity leave, that is non-transferable, just as you were both talking about earlier, and they take on solo parenting of the baby. And this means that they are not debriefed, that they aren't just babysitting, that they aren't just doing the fun stuff, taking the baby out of the house, but they have, it's only a matter of weeks. It's actually not that long a period. That research is showing in the UK, some great research in Manchester by Helen Norman, using the Millennium Cohort Study, that if fathers take on that solo parenting, they see a positive effect when the child is 5 years old in terms of the father involvement and just that sort of better balance in the home. So I think getting men involved, just as you've said, is so vital. And yet we seem reluctant to really go the whole way. I know it's part of a discussion currently, but in Parliament, but I think we really have to take the sort of policies seriously, and we do know what works. So actually, my question, Joanna, is about, are you dismayed by the pace of change?
Yes, but then I'm very impatient. Yes, and I'm worried that change might go backwards somewhat. So we have to be very alert with men and women and the young people. And I'm slightly dismayed by what's going on with some young men in finding their male identity, because we need to really underline to them and get them to see with good practicing fathers that it's quite all right to be a caring father and to work with small children and to do all the things that you have to do with babies and things. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done with men. I do think a huge amount of the young men that I come across are brilliant fathers. In completely different way to my generation, where they hardly went near their children except at tea time. So there's a lot of work still to be done with that. And again, I think this is about storytelling and people showing examples of what they do and why it's important.
Thank you.
We got a few questions I'm going to read out. So we got a question from Michael. You have been on a large number of boards, and in many cases you have been the chair. However, in the voluntary sector, there are still too few female chairs. Can you talk about your different perceptions from your role as a chair and as a trustee? And how can we get in that sector of societies more, getting more female chairs?
Well, we want to say we want to be chair and put ourselves up for being asked to be chair or to be selected to be chair, and not suffer too much of, oh my goodness, do they really want me? Am I up to it? Because I think probably men think some of that as well, but not quite as much as we do. I think being a chair is wonderful. I think it's particularly if you have a board that's very good. So I think people who are chair, whether it's men or women, need to make sure that they've got a board of bright people, supportive people who are thinking in the same way, and you've got a good common view about values and policies. So I'm hoping that more women in the public sector will want to chair. And I think there are far more chairs in the private sector, and women are going up the ladder, as it were. But there's plenty of room to get far more as well.
It's a bit ironic in a sense, because the public sector, there are more women working in the public sector, but then you see less of them on the boards. But the private sector, especially the corporate, maybe I wonder whether it was that push that there was, all that work that Lord Davis did around getting more women on company boards, and that regular reporting and monitoring of how the FTSE company were doing. And I wonder whether it also generated some kind of, because this information was publicly published, and where there was a little bit of competitiveness there, where companies, you could see which companies had a much more balanced board compared to others, and whether that actually, do you think that helped in terms of getting, maybe it would help in the public sector or charities as well, that kind of visibility in terms to get them to commit to do more in terms to achieve a balanced board.
I agree utterly about the visibility. I think, Simonetta, I've told you once before that I noticed in the insurance industry there were very, very few women. This was in the early 90s. And so my nice boss at the Industrial Society said, right, we must organise a lunch. And he got the chairman of the Prudential to organise a lunch for me. And I had to find out before we got anchored and sat down for lunch, which of the other CEOs and chairmen who'd come from the other big insurance companies was possibly going to be the champion of women in insurance. And I found a lovely man called Joe Palmer from Legal and General, who had a wife going back to university or going to university for the first time, and he had two daughters of whom he was terribly proud. And he led, he was the patron of women in insurance. And all the other companies said, well, we can't let Legal and General get away with it. Who were clearly showing in their results that they were benefiting from having a lot of upcoming and brilliant women. And so they all rattled round. So I do think having some champions who continue to say this is important and it being visible and that they can, the Sunday Times best company to work for is very important. You get the best people going there. And it's got that reputation because they're offering some of these policies we've been talking about.
Yes, and then we're
the culture.
Yeah, remember, I think we discussed this in one of the podcasts as well. Yes, so there is another question, Larissa. Very anecdotally, it feels that like currently everyone is feeling a loss of work-life balance. This is especially true in the higher education sector in UK. Is there any current research on this globally, and then distinguishing on gender lines?
I can't answer that one because I'm not aware enough of what's going on in higher education. Maybe you can, Simonetta.
Well, we got also Sarah here on the call. I don't know, Sarah, whether you're still there. I think we do have a lot of flexibility in higher education in terms of policies, and also would say practices. Sometimes one of the things that I personally have noticed, and I would be interested to hear what Sarah might have to say, is that you can have a difference between the policies. I mean, you can have a lot of really good policies and the practice. And the practice sometimes very much depends on the local managers, how responsive they are, how well they understand, so you can have a little bit of a split in a sense between what is the organization trying to achieve and how the people at the local level, to what extent they're implementing what the organization is trying to achieve. I remember when we did a big piece of work-life balance at Oxford Brookes, we did a survey, some interviews, focus group. It was a major piece of work. That was one of the main issues, that a lot depended how people experience work-life balance. It wasn't so much in what the university was making available, but how the line manager, how responsive and the line manager was to these issues.
And the line manager's manager needs to ask them what they're doing and how easy they're making it, or how difficult and what the challenge is, and how is their own work-life balance, because I bet they're pressurized as well.
Absolutely, and it's achieving that consistencies across also a consistency across the university, across the organization, whether it's a university or different organizations, because sometimes you can have some who are very responsive, some are not, and then you get people being ended up, in spite of the institution and aspiration, ended up perhaps treated slightly differently. I've got more question here. Let's see whether we can try to get through. So another question is, how far do you feel that the glass ceiling has risen within recent years, if at all?
How the glass ceiling has been made.
The glass ceiling in terms of women not being able to progress in their careers.
No, I think it's I think it depends enormously on the organizations, but I think it has got much, much thinner, the glass. And, huge numbers of very good women have gone up the organizations, even if they may not be right at the top yet. And I think the culture has changed a lot in the community as well as in organisations. But of course, there are barriers, and of course, there are going to be biases, and of course, there are going to be very traditional ways of still looking at it. But I think there's been a lot of progress, and we need to keep it up, and we need to regard it for the younger generation that this is what one expects, and this makes sense, and it's fair, and it's exciting for women, and it's good for men and good for families too.
I think Sarah is happy to be unmuted. Going back to the question about the higher education.
Hi, yes. So I was not particularly going to comment on that last question about the glass ceiling, although I would like to note that in this institution, we have very, very good gender parity right up to the top levels. In relation to work-life balance, you were talking about the extent to which you achieve good work-life balance through having good supportive policies as opposed to having good local implementation. And I think that's absolutely right. And the stats would suggest we're doing well on that here in terms of having very supportive policies and approving a very high proportion of requests that are made for flexible working. But my observation, this is the second HEI I've worked in HR, is that there are other things that have a really significant impact on that it's much more difficult to manage. One of which is just workload and the fact that we are in a sector that's really financially constrained at the moment. And that's much harder for an institution to tackle. And the other is around culture and the fact that in higher education, there is a sense that people progress their careers by doing more and doing more research and pressing themselves to do more and attending seminars that start at 5:30 in the evening when they could be picking up the kids from school and making dinner. There's all sorts of things like that we haven't entirely managed to tackle yet, and we haven't managed to get the message through that progression is about quality, not quantity. That's exacerbated by the fact that people typically go into higher education because they love it and feel passionate about it and committed to it. And that's a wonderful thing, but it does mean that people drive themselves to do more and work harder. So the point I just wanted to make is that I think we do really well on a lot of things as an institution, but there's so many things that make a difference. It's really difficult to tackle all of those at the same time.
Is there quite a lot of open discussion about these sort of issues?
There is at the moment. We've, as an institution, we've just we did a full staff survey last year, and we've just done a pulse survey. And it does show that work-life balance is the main area that we are really struggling in terms of supporting our staff to have a good experience at work.
Well, that's important you're doing the surveys. And it's interesting because there's a lot of women now whether it's in vice chancellors, heads of colleges in Oxford University around the country. And it would be interesting to know whether, in fact, when they get together in some of these very senior groups, whether this is ever on the agenda. And they're able to say that it's important, because one does need the message coming through the culture of organisations that this is important, and recognising that the pressure of the workload and the economy and all of that is not making it easier, and trying to see whether one can come to some sort of solution around it.
Yeah, I know that when HR directors get together, that's what they're talking about. And I know that I see lots of discussions at the senior team at this university about it. I don't know to what extent VCs are discussing it with each other.
We must encourage them.
Yes.
Yes. So I think we have almost reached the end of our time, but before we go, I can't see any other questions. I can see Michael is thank you, Joanna, and someone who suggested on 5:30 you can also cook dinner at the same time. So thanks for your suggestion. Before we go, Joanna, can I ask you for a final thought about what would be your final message? And thank you to our audience. I think we really had a very good discussion, some very good questions, thoughts. People spoke about their experience, both personal and professional. So what kind of message would you like us to live with?
Well, thinking politically, which of course is rather difficult. There's pre-budget days, but I do think the childcare issue remains a big issue in holidays as well as in term time. And of course, social care as ageing population. This is going to become even more complicated than it is now. So politically, we need to keep up the visibility of these issues, and we need to keep on encouraging the young people in our lives to remember that actually we have to fight for these sort of issues, and we have to demonstrate that actually it's good to try and have a balanced life, and not to work one's backside off all the time, because that's not good for one's mental health, one's relationships, any of that. So I think the more open discussion there is, the better, because I think there are a lot of challenging bombs coming at us in different ways, which we need to try and diffuse. And it's difficult whether one's in full-time employment, part-time employment, when the cost of living is so high. And I can tell you it's quite difficult at my stage of life, when I'm doing a lot of different projects in the community, to remember that actually I need a bit of work-life balance as well, and sleep and time for friends and keeping well and keeping fit, and all those things are important, because if we neglect them, it's going to be bad for everyone.
Well, Joanna, thank you very much. I mean, it was great to talk to you. And indeed, it's really important to know how much work this has taken, not giving it for granted. And indeed, you know, the present political climate, especially, it's really important that we keep this development, we keep work-life balance and what has been gained, and maintain it also for the future generations. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our audience, and for what was a really lively conversation. I have to say, this was the best I ever had online. So thank you very much for being so participative. Thank you very much to our team, Ellie and Matti in the background, who have been helping to facilitate and deal.
They've been doing lots of nodding, which has been
doing a lot of technical stuff. I can see there is some people are just saying thank you, so thank you. And if there are any, I can see there are one or two questions perhaps we didn't manage to get through, but I'm sure do get in touch with us, and we will ask Joanna for her views on that.
And lots of points we haven't been able to make, but so when you have a bit of time,
we can have another conversation.
Yes.
We have and indeed listen to the podcast. And just a reminder, we got also that wonderful material, that wonderful collection in our library. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.